With Brian's disappearance becoming international news, sightings of him popped up in foreign countries and other states. One in Michigan was provided by a girl on a road trip who saw a waiter that looked exactly like Brian. His name tag even said Brian S. When the police visited the restaurant he worked at, however, there wasn't a Brian working there. Lori and Randy thought about driving up to Michigan that night, but decided against it, and the sighting was eventually determined not to be Brian. It is possible that the girl had misread his name tag, or a waiter had forgotten his name tag and grabbed an old one. Sometime during the early weeks of the search, Clint got a lawyer. He'd already come in for several interviews and helped with the initial searches as well as passing out flyers. When police asked him to take a polygraph, he refused. There were rumors that Randy had accused him of knowing something about Brian's disappearance during one of the searches. Whatever his reasoning, quickly afterward, more rumors about Clint would make rounds on the internet. People claimed that he had offered additional information if he were given immunity in the crime. Others questioned his friendship with Brian, pointing to the lack of text between them and the fact that they had had other falling outs. In an interview with Kelly Bruce later on, Don Corbett would point to an incident where the two were at a baseball game, and Brian ended up getting punched in the face during an altercation. But whether this was somehow Clint's fault is unclear. Whether he knows more than he is saying or not, the internet rumor mill frequently paints him as the main suspect. On May 11th, at around 2 a.m., Brian's apartment was broken into. It was just one of 3 in the same complex that had been robbed, including his next-door neighbor who had their door kicked down. Someone stole a TV and some DVDs, but did not touch the 2 guitars in his apartment or any of his other electronics. Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. Columbus police called Alexis just an hour later at 3 a.m. In a dispatch article, Columbus police urged anyone who knew anything about the disappearance to come forward, because the reward for information was temporarily boosted to $100,000 for a few days in the hope that someone would call in. No one did, and it dropped back down to $25,500. The break-in was determined to likely be unrelated to the case. That same day, fellow OSU student Hiroshi Hayashi vanished on his way to class. His car was found near Tuttle Mall, and after missing not only class, but a club meeting on the weekend that he was scheduled to speak at, his classmates and family grew deeply concerned. He lived with his parents in Grove City and was not the type to just run off. He put a lot of focus on his studies and stayed out of trouble. His family reached out to the Shaffer family, wondering if their cases were connected, and Hiroshi's brother remarked that Brian looked familiar. Hiroshi had gone to the same high school as Brian and Julie Popovich. On May 16th, Hiroshi Hayashi walked into a police station in Athens, Georgia, and told police he had been kidnapped. He said he'd been on his way to class when a stranger approached him asking for directions. The stranger hit him over the head, and when he regained consciousness, he was tied up and blindfolded in the back of a truck. He told police he had been held against his will for 5 days and brought to Athens. Very quickly, after being read his Miranda rights, though, he confessed that he had made this story up. Georgia police held him on suicide watch and set his bail at $10,000. They were waiting for his parents to pick him up and did not expect to press any charges. The Dispatch wrote an article explaining why they don't cover more cases of missing people on May 21st. In many cases of missing adults, they don't want to be found or just needed a break, and reporting on them would just make their problems worse, like in the case of Hiroshi. They typically only cover missing adults if authorities have reason to suspect foul play, and in this case, had covered Hiroshi's disappearance because it was just a month after Brian Shaffer vanished, there had been no activity on his bank account or email, and he had gone to the same high school as Brian Shaffer. It is not illegal for an adult to run away, and it can be tough to decide which cases need the attention of the media. In a May 18th interview on Fox News, Randy stressed his opinion that Brian didn't run away, and he was certain that foul play was to blame, saying, "I don't think there's any possibility he just took off. I know Brian's personality way too well. He's got too many things going good for him. His grades were good in school, the fact that he wanted to go on vacation, he had a deep love for Alexis and also for me and his mom. He just wanted to do the best that he could, and the one thing he said is, 'You inspired me to do great things one day.' To me, that's enough right there to say that Brian had a goal, an objective. He knew which way he was going, and somebody interrupted that and messed it up. and I want to find out who it is and get him back. I firmly think that something happened that was not good, and it wasn't just Brian taking off. After getting nonstop calls from a psychic, Randy, his brother, and Kevin Miles went to search the Olentangy River. Apparently the psychic was convinced that Brian's body was trapped against one of the concrete support beams. Randy broke down and went to go check for himself. His brother helped him search the river, while Miles waited on hand to jump in if there was an emergency. Randy fell down in the river at one point, almost getting swept away in the current, but he searched every pillar around the bridge and found nothing. Corbett eventually reached out to Alexis and asked her the tough questions about their relationship, asking how often they were intimate and if it was possible Brian was gay but afraid to come out. In an October 1st Dispatch article, Alexis told reporters about how she had been questioning her relationship with Brian, wondering if he really did love her, until she found his email password. She'd had most of his passwords already and kept tabs on his account, but this one surprised and reassured her. His email password was Alexis Love Mary, all one word. In early June, Alexis went out shopping to help a friend pick out a bridesmaid's dress. The trip reminded her too much of her own wedding that she thought she might be planning soon, and she ended up crying in her mother's arms. That summer, Alexis sold the tickets she and Brian had for the upcoming Pearl Jam concert in Cincinnati, writing, "Someday I promise I will see them, but I think I would be more likely to cry through the whole thing." Tim Schafer went to the concert in an effort to raise awareness for Brian. Eddie Vedder even gave a rough description of Brian, calling him a real handsome guy, and urged the crowd to keep an eye out for him. Brian's lease at his King Avenue apartment ended on July 1st. Alexis brought a moving van over, and Randy and Dawn hugged her and helped her move things out of his apartment. Hovering reporters peppered her with questions, and she told them that she hadn't given up. She just couldn't renew his lease. On her blog, she wrote, quote, "I would be lying to say that it wasn't a sad, sad day that had the feeling of a funeral hanging over it for myself and Brian's dad and brother. Now we don't have any place to go to be with Brian." According to Dan, when they were moving his bed, they found the word alone scratched into the wall, though in later interviews Hearst says this is not true. In July, Alexis and her classmates started working rounds in local hospitals, the class that Brian should have been a part of. On August 18th, the Columbus police released a part of the surveillance video and asked the public to help them find a man in an orange sweater who had been seen entering and exiting the bar several times. The new potential break in the case brought Brian's friends and family together, and they discussed their theories, some saying that he simply ran away. Alexis hoped that was the case, though it would have hurt. She wanted him to be okay. At work the next day, when a patient asked her if she had a boyfriend, she said, quote, "I did. I still might. I don't know." On August 23, 2006, Randy went on Fox News to discuss Brian's disappearance. He brought up that police were searching for a man in an orange sweater who had been seen going in and out of the bar several times. Then he went on to detail more about Brian's disappearance. He said that at exactly 1:57 a.m., Brian told Clinton Meredith that he wanted to hang back for a bit and talk to the band. They walked over to the car, and at just after 2 a.m., Meredith called Brian. It went straight to voicemail, and she left him a message saying, quote, "Where are you? Where in the hell are you?" He then went on to say that it's possible Brian went to the construction site, but the Columbus Police Department had searched it very thoroughly several times. This was the first time someone mentioned that Brian had gone to talk to the band in a published interview, though they had already been cleared by the police at this time. If that's not enough, the members of True Crime Garage knew the guitar player of the band, and he had no recollection of Brian even attempting to make contact with the band that night. For several years, internet sleuths suspected that the band had something to do with it, going so far as to say that Brian's body could have been smuggled out in guitar cases or other equipment. The name of the band wasn't released until 2018 when Kelly Bruce and Nick West asked Hearst about it, and he sent them the name right away. It sounds like the name was likely never brought up on the news. The very next day, on August 24th, Alexis went on Fox News to give them more updates and details on the case. The man in the orange sweatshirt had gone up to the police right away and told them he was looking for his friend, who was his ride home. His story checked out, and he was cleared of suspicion. The interviewer, Greta von Susterson, asked Alexis about the friends Brian was seen with, and she said, quote, "The friends that he was last seen with are students of another friend of his, another person that he had been with throughout the evening. She went on to say that she hadn't spoken to them since April, and she knew the police had talked to them. This is a bit vague, and Alexis is likely referring to Amber or Brighton, since Clint was a TA. But it's possible she meant Brian had been spending time with a professor friend earlier in the evening as well, and Clint and Meredith were students of this other person. There were other people he talked to that night, and it's been over a decade since that interview was aired, so even if she did mean he was spending time with a professor, that person was likely cleared of suspicion early on. Alexis went on to say that she hopes he is okay and just decided to run away, but she doesn't think it's likely and worries that something bad happened to him. They interviewed Randy next, and he said that while he recognized that a few detectives were putting immense amounts of work into the case, he doesn't understand why the surveillance videos were released only recently. Eventually, after spending months going over the footage, police tracked everyone who went up the escalators that night, coming down later that same night. Brian Shaffer was the only one seen on camera entering the bar, but not leaving the bar. Randy was obsessive about his search. He wrote repetitive letters to Clint and Meredith, begging them to come forward if they knew something. He would go over different scenarios, trying his hardest to figure out what happened with the limited information he had. He frequently called Lori Davis just to talk about the case, and one day called her 30 separate times. He would also call John Hurst to talk, sometimes in the middle of the night if he thought he'd figured something out, or just needed a sympathetic ear. On September 8th, Alexis called Brian's phone at around 11:30 p.m. before bed, a ritual she'd kept up every day without fail since April 1st. She and Randy had been paying Brian's bills, hoping that if he were alive, he would reach out to them. His cell phone had never been recovered, and it was in his name. For the first time since March 31st, his phone rang. It rang 3 or 4 times, then went straight to voicemail. Alexis called a few more times, and each time it would ring before going to voicemail. She got her brother to call Brian, and the phone rang again. Alexis called the CPD and Randy. Before long, Randy, Derek, Alexis, and a few local officers were calling Brian's phone. The last call went out sometime between 3 and 5 a.m., and then when someone called again at 8 a.m. on that Saturday, it wasn't ringing anymore. However, the next day, on September 10th, it rang all day long, starting at around 8 a.m. Alexis checked Brian's phone records and credit cards every day, and there was no activity on any of his accounts. If someone had turned on his phone, they hadn't made any calls or received any voicemails. The calls were later determined by Brian's phone carrier to be a glitch. Though they had pinged off of a cell tower in Hilliard, this doesn't necessarily mean that the phone was used in the vicinity of that cell tower. Whether this was really a glitch is still a hotly debated topic. In a September 21st Fox News interview, Randy expressed his frustration with how the Columbus Police Department was handling the search, saying, quote, "Almost 6 months have gone by, and I don't know any more now than what I did 6 months ago. Certain things I wish the police would tell me some of what they've done as far as that. Sometimes, I don't know how much they understand. I would almost like to say to them sometimes, what would you do if it was your son, your daughter? Would you bend the rules just a little bit? Because it seems that certain people want to go by the rule book so much. And I think it's time to tell me what's happened, what they've done, what they have done in the search, and I haven't heard anything from them at all about what they've done yet." In later interviews, John Hurst would talk about how not everything regarding the case can be released. Open cases are not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, and he cannot disclose every detail about the case with the public. On September 25th, 2006, Alexis wrote the following letter to the editor in The Lantern. "I wanted to take the opportunity to remind everyone to be very careful when they are out during the night. For those of you who don't know the story, on April 1st, my boyfriend Brian Shaffer disappeared after being out for the evening. We still don't know, almost 6 months later, what has happened to him or where he could be. Please don't let this happen to you or your friends, as it is an absolute nightmare for everyone who loves and cares about you. Please don't walk alone at night, and keep your eyes on your friends you go out with. There is strength and there is safety in numbers, and it is just as important to watch out for each other as it is for yourself. Have fun this year. Just don't forget that being safe makes the year a whole lot better. Alexis Waggoner, OSU medical student." In a September 27th Fox News interview, Randy led a news crew through the Ugly Tuna, taking them through the layout of the building and talking about how he went back and forth on how Brian had gotten out. When asked about how he was feeling and what he thought happened, Randy said, quote, It's something you don't really want to experience because it's just awful. I mean, especially when I lost my wife, too. She loved him so much, and he cared for her so much. And that's another reason he wouldn't do this, because she's gone. I mean, he looked after his mother. He wanted to make her proud. So he makes her proud whether she's here alive on earth, whether she's up in heaven looking at him. He's going to do it, and I truly think that. I just don't think that he just wandered off. In that same interview, when asked about whether she thought it was possible that Brian just wandered off, Alexis said, quote, I hope so, but I don't think so. I want that to be it. I want him to be somewhere. I want him to be okay. And if he is, that would be amazing. But I just have a hard time believing that he would walk away from everything when he was talking about a future, and it was only a few days before that he said to me, let's skip school tomorrow and go get married. The very next day, Brian's professor, Charles Hitchcock, went on the same program to discuss the disappearance. He didn't have a prominent theory that stuck out to him, but he talked about how the community had come together to support Randy and made the students grow closer together, saying, quote, it's been actually quite remarkable. It's brought the class, and not only his class, but the entire community of medical students here and faculty together. October 1st was almost 6 months since Brian disappeared, and in a reflective Columbus Dispatch article highlighting Alexis's struggle, John Hurst said of her, quote, she's a bright young lady. I think she's sincere. Her feelings towards Brian are true. While Randy said, quote, I feel for her greatly. She's a very beautiful girl. She's very intelligent. I know Brian really cared for her. Near the end of the article, Alexis pondered how long she would wait for Brian. She knows she wants to have a family someday, and it's been 6 months with no word. She worries that her lack of closure could complicate future relationships if and when she is ready to move on. In the meantime, she focuses on her studies. On January 7th, 2007, Sally Sheesby finally got what she promised her son Jonathan at his funeral. Governor Bob Taft signed a bill standardizing the practices statewide for how missing adult cases should be handled. Randy and Tony Luzio Jr. stood with her, hoping this bill might help other families who are going through what they went through. Though Randy wished it would have included something about providing families with regular updates, he knew it was a good start. It required entering the missing person's information into a national database within a week if foul play was suspected, or 30 days if it wasn't. It also required that DNA be taken from unidentified Jane and John Does and sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Sally said, quote, Jonathan, I know, is smiling down right now. He's saying, Mom, you did what you said you would do. This law gives people the gift of hope. A yearly reflective piece done by the Dispatch caught up with Alexis and John Hurst. Alexis still had Brian's things in her house and still calls his phone every day, though she did note how she'd put many of his possessions out of sight. Quote, I put his things in the back of my closet, and I just needed that chapter of my life to be over. There were a lot of tears and it was sad, but it was time to move forward. She wrote on her blog, quote, I want to go downtown or drive down High Street without almost driving off the road multiple times. I catch myself still looking at everyone walking down the street. The men with beards, I try to see their profile or how they walk to make sure it's not Brian. I look between houses and under steps to apartments. Derek had also been faithfully calling Brian's phone, though the calls were fewer and further between, and eventually would stop not so long after April. John Hurst expressed his frustration about the lack of updates, saying the case was, quote, the most frustrating one I've ever dealt with in my life. On August 22nd of 2007, Tony Luzio Sr. and Randy went on Fox News with Tim Miller, the founder of EquiSearch, to discuss their missing sons. Miller had come up from Texas with his team and their equipment to try to do a more thorough search of some areas that may have been overlooked in both cases. Miller said he'd been moved by Randy and Tony's passion for finding their children. Quote, I've actually been working with Randy for the last 2 or 3 months, talking to him and then met Tony last week. And you know, when you meet these fathers, how do you say no to them? The two fathers had become close over the last several months. When talking about their ordeal, Luzio said, quote, you know, it's kind of a double-edged sword, you know? It's, in a way, we want closure, but not having closure gives us just a smidgen of hope that somehow maybe he's out there and still alive. Randy noted how his family had been halved in such a short amount of time. Quote, it's been extremely hard for me. I mean, my wife was such a beautiful lady, and I still can't believe she's gone at 51. And losing Brian 3 weeks after that, so I get by. When EquiSearch visited Ohio, hopes were high that they might finally provide some answers, but unfortunately, the search turned up nothing for the missing men. 2 years after Brian's disappearance in 2008, the Lantern caught up with Alexis. She had graduated and was ready to start her first residency with the same class of students she and Brian had started with. She'd been determined not to let his disappearance keep her from pursuing her dream job, and had finally paid off. She got assigned to Riverside Methodist Hospital, just a stone's throw away from the edge of campus, and remarked how making more good memories in that part of town might be good for her. She worries more than she should when her friends or her brother are out and checks in with them often. Her brother mentioned that she had finally thrown away what he had dubbed the Brian Shrine, which had been a collection of Brian's possessions she'd kept for him in case he came back. She was ready to move on. In regards to romance, she told the Lantern, "I would say it was about 1.5 years afterward when I started feeling like a normal person again, because that was about the time that I told my mom that I thought I was at the point where maybe I could go out and eat dinner with someone again and get out there and have fun again." Her mother, Melanie, was ready to jump at the opportunity to get her daughter back out there. She had been talking a bit with a contractor working on her house in Toledo. His name was Eric Noss, and she told him about her daughter's unusual situation and decided to try and play matchmaker with them. Alexis reluctantly agreed, and the two fell into a serious relationship, having been together for 5 months as of April 1st, 2008. Eric was understanding that Alexis still had complicated feelings regarding Brian, and would lend a sympathetic ear when she did want to talk about it. He said, quote, "It's not my intention to replace their memories, just make new ones." On April 29th, 2009, NBC ran a piece about how the retired detectives behind the famous smiley face killer theory thought Brian's case could be connected. This theory is an American counterpart to the famous Manchester Pusher in the UK, and says that many cases where men in their 20s drown in rivers could be connected. Since graffiti of a smiley face is often found within a few miles of where the bodies of these young men are found, some people have decided that these deaths could be the work of a serial killer. Others call this out as a hoax, noting that drunk men in their 20s often just fall into rivers by accident, and the timing and motive of these killings wouldn't make any sense. Randy said, quote, "It's hard for me to go on with my life. It still is. I'm just sort of stuck in limbo because of all this stuff sometimes. I listen to it, and I guess I try to say, whether it be psychics or this, well, okay, if that's so, show me some information. Show some proof that you have, that you know this could have happened to my son, and I haven't seen that proof yet." Just weeks after that interview, Hurricane Ike brought hurricane-force winds into the Midwest. Schools closed, and one of the largest power outages in the Midwest took days to repair among crews cleaning up trees and down power lines. Ohio alone suffered over $560 million of damage. 195 people were killed, 26 of those in landlocked states, and among them was Randy Shaffer. He was walking to his backyard shed, presumably to start cleaning up the damage from the storm, when he was struck and killed by a falling tree branch. Randy's obituary spoke of his love of music, family, and his sense of humor. One excerpt reading, quote, "There was never a stranger in Randy's life. He made such beautiful music with his saxophone that friends requested he entertain at many area churches, bringing peace and tranquility at solemn moments, and entertaining at many other gatherings. He was always willing when asked for his time to play. He will be a great addition to Heaven's Orchestra." Randy's family was one of the most important parts of his being. He loved to try and beat his sister, brother, and father on the tennis court, and always has great stories of his victories, whether he won or not. Though the obituary said he was survived by both of his sons, it did mention Brian's disappearance, saying, quote, "After the passing of Randy's beloved wife Renee in 2006 and the disappearance of his son Brian, Randy was relentless in his search for Brian and never gave up hope. He made hundreds of friends and helped many other families in search of their loved ones, while being involved with the Crime Stoppers organization. He'll be sadly missed by all of the people whose lives he touched." Kevin Miles had become so close to Randy over the years that he was asked to give his eulogy at the funeral. Comments poured in on his obituary from friends, family, and strangers who had been touched by Randy's relentless search for his son. One comment quickly caught everyone's attention. It read, quote, "I miss you, Dad. Love, Brian. U.S. Virgin Islands." In articles covering his death and the suspicious comment left on his memorial page, the Lantern interviewed Don Corbett, while the other paper of Columbus, Ohio, interviewed John Hurst. The comment was quickly determined to be a hoax, and Derek would describe it as, quote, disgusting that someone would pull that kind of prank. In Hearst's interview, he said that the posting was likely a hoax and that it was made from a public computer in Franklin County. He said, quote, for somebody to do something like this, it's horrific. The family's been through so much. Hearst noted that with such a highly publicized case, hoaxes and false leads were unavoidable. He said they still get tips and investigate them all, even though most have turned out to be dead ends. He went on to say that they looked into every tip that was called in and implored the public to come forward if they knew anything, saying, quote, you may have thought something you heard in a casual conversation was nothing and just blew it off. We need those people to call. That's usually what helps solve this type of case. Let us determine if it's important information or not. The identity of the sender was never released to the public if it was ever found. Just in case there was any substance to it, police in the Virgin Islands were given information about Brian's case, and news about his disappearance was aired on local networks. Despite this, in his interview, Corbett detailed his frustration with how the police were handling the case. He thought it wasn't right that Randy never got to see the full records of the investigation and continued to try to talk to the police and access the full records in case there was anything they were missing. In later interviews with Kelly Bruce and Nick West, Corbett and Hearst would double down on their respective viewpoints. Hearst stressed that open cases are not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests, and police reserve the right to keep some information from the public. Corbett said that when the comment was posted, he tried to ask Hearst if the computer had a camera anywhere that would have caught the person who posted it, but Hearst declined to answer, though Hearst would later say in the Comeback podcast that there weren't any cameras that could have caught the suspect. On April 13, 2009, The Lantern, the same paper that frequently interviewed Corbett, but that John Hearst and the rest of the CPD tended to avoid, ran an interesting article claiming that Neil Rosenberg, Clint's attorney, spoke to a detective working the case. He told Don Corbett over the phone and in an email that police gave him reason to believe Brian was alive. It's unclear if this was Hearst. In his email, Rosenberg said, quote, if Brian is alive, which is what I'm led to believe after speaking with the detective involved, then it is Brian and not Clint who is causing his family pain and hardship. Brian should come forward and end this. He went on to clarify that Clint had refused the CPD's request for a polygraph and Corbett's repeated requests for a polygraph at Rosenberg's advice, as polygraphs are unreliable. He said as far as he and Clint were concerned, the matter was closed, and Clint told Corbett in an email that although he appreciates him trying to find Brian, any questions Corbett has for him need to go through his attorney first. The email was cordial, and if anyone has tried to talk to Clint through his lawyer, it hasn't been publicized. The article went on to interview friends and family members. Meredith Reed confirmed that she had in fact taken and passed a polygraph. Clint was the only one who law enforcement had asked to take a polygraph who hadn't complied. Many of Brian's friends and family members saw this as suspicious. Derek said, quote, I've always thought he definitely knows something, just won't come forward with it. If Brian did take off somewhere, if that is the case, we just always had a strong feeling that Clint would possibly know that. Alexis leans more towards the foul play angle, but still thinks that Clint knows something that he isn't saying. Her father, Tom, said, quote, the gist of my perspective on Clint Florence is that I think that basically all roads making any progress on the case on Brian Shaffer lead through Clint Florence. The Columbus Monthly, on June 30th of 2009, ran a piece reflecting on the fact that Randy never found the answers he was looking for in life. Kevin Miles said that, quote, it haunts me that we still don't know where Brian is. In that same interview, Lori Davis talked about her own quest for answers and how she's been immersed in the case from the start, up to 2009. She talked about how she had her teenage son take pictures of the ugly tuna when she went to visit to conduct her own investigation. She talked about how the case is still getting attention, saying, quote, the internet won't let this case die. People a lot more distant than even me want answers. This case haunts them. I think it's because any of us could be in that situation. I have to fight against becoming so paranoid about it that I can't live my life. Shortly after she said that, the journalist mentioned that her son, who was with her during the interview, got up to walk to the bathroom, and Lori told him, quote, if someone tries to take you, you scream. He was 13 years old at the time, and it was his birthday. On April 2nd, 2011, NBC ran a segment talking about how neither the Shaffer or Luzio case had ever been solved. Lori Davis had organized a blood drive to raise awareness for Brian's case. She figured since he was a medical student, helping people in that small way might be a nice gesture. Kevin Miles noted how nothing new had been learned in either case, and Tony Luzio Sr. said, quote, "In my career, many times I'd go on a missing adult or missing persons case and just really felt sorry for the family, thinking that will never happen to me. And I hope it never happens to me. And it did happen to me." 3 years later, closure would be provided for the Luzio family in October of 2014. A nonprofit group had continued searching long past when the funds ran out, looking in over 200 lakes and ponds in Delaware County. They finally pinged a car in a water retention pond near Powell, a pond that had even been previously drained. When they drained it again, the car was so decayed and covered in algae that it was easy to see how it could have been missed the first time. Inside the car, they found Tony Luzio Jr.'s body. Luzio Sr. said, quote, "After 9.5 years to prepare for this, we thought we would be ready for the inevitable, but it hurts as bad as if it happened yesterday." April 1st of 2016 brought about the 10-year anniversary of Brian's disappearance. The Dispatch interviewed everyone closely related to the case. Derek remarked on how he'd been too tired to join Brian on campus that night and said, quote, "I've thought about that night over and over and over for 10 years. What if I had been there that night? Would things have been different? Would my brother still be here? I've carried that guilt around for a while." Once again, the subject of Clint was brought up, and Derek said, quote, "If I saw him, I'd say, 'Where the hell is my brother?' If anyone knows whether he's still alive or something has happened to him, it's Clint." After 10 years, Alexis was an OBGYN who loved her job and had moved to Toledo with Eric Noss, who is now her husband. They have 2 children together and couldn't be happier. Noss told the Dispatch that, quote, "I met the right girl and my life changed in the best way possible. There was just no doubt in my mind that even if Brian came back around, we were going to be together. I just never was worried about it or thought about it. Everyone has a past, and I think that period of Alexis's life made her stronger. She has fully moved on, and though she occasionally still wonders what happened, it doesn't affect her life." She said, quote, "It almost feels like this all happened to someone else. It was all in a different life for me." Hearst talked about how emotionally involved he has become in the case, noting that he still did not really have a theory that he believed. He said he doesn't know if the case will ever be solved. Quote, "The answers that everyone wants, everyone needs, I don't know if we'll ever have them." NBC ran a similar segment for the anniversary, talking about the similarities between Brian's case and that of Joey LaBute. Joey had been a 26-year-old out for a night of fun with his friends. He wasn't much for the bar scene, but went to Union, a local gay bar, with one of his friends to celebrate them coming out. He was a level-headed guy who loved the beach and nights in with friends. He was last seen on the Union security camera leaving the building. After sending 2 somewhat incoherent texts to friends in the next few hours, he vanished. His body was found in the Scioto River near the Scioto Audubon Metro Park. He was likely dead before he went into the water, but the exact cause of death is unknown. Since he was the same rough demographic as Brian Shaffer, online sleuths tried to connect the 2 cases, especially those who believed the smiley face theory. Derek and John Hearst talked about how the case brought back a lot of painful memories for them. Hearst said about the case that, quote, "We've got another family out there who's going through what the Shaffers went through. Listening to it brought back a lot of memories about what we had to do and what we went through. How agonizing this type of situation is for the family members." On April 15th, 2018, the annual March for the Missing saw Lori Davis in the spotlight once again, saying to an NBC reporter, quote, "Unfortunately, there have not been leads that have led to anything in Brian's case. I think that people might be afraid to talk, and I think after 12 years, they need to buck up, and they need to start speaking." May 1st of 2018 was the last senior crawl the Ugly Tuna would see. The bar's lease had expired with the building owner, and the Ugly Tuna was going to be looking for a new location. Hearst told the Dispatch on May 3rd that, quote, "Anytime the name Ugly Tuna comes up, that's the first thing that pops into my head." He and Andre Edwards still look into any tips that come in, but 10 years after the fact, those are few and far in between. Hearst, always the optimist, said, quote, "I think at some point everything will come together. It's like a puzzle. We put pieces in, and we have to work at getting them to fit." In a 2019 interview, Brian's cousin Dan would describe Brian as, quote, "dark and secretive," and that he wouldn't have been surprised if Brian had some kind of drug problem that factored into his disappearance. In an interview with the same host, Corbett would insist that there was no way Brian had a drug problem. Corbett went on to say that Brian did certainly have secrets that he kept from the people close to him. He told Bruce about how sometime after Brian's disappearance, the father of one of Brian's friends brought over a box of Brian's belongings. Among the box was a bunch of Brian's writings that Corbett described as, quote, dark and bizarre. To this day, Don Corbett still gets tips on the case. Just this past year in 2019, someone sent him photos of a man in India who matched Brian's description very closely. Though he looked a lot like him, family members determined that it was not him. Corbett continues to be frustrated by the fact that the Columbus police aren't doing yearly interviews with the people who last saw Brian, saying they could catch a potential slip-up in their stories. However, it's worth pointing out that in the first few years, Corbett himself and Randy had inconsistencies in their stories. It's very easy to misremember details or misquote something months after a case, let alone years after. When he disappeared, Brian was wearing a yellow cancer awareness bracelet in honor of his mother. To this day, Derek still wears a green missing persons bracelet to honor Brian. In the latest investigation discovery piece on the case, Alexis was notably absent, and her pictures were blurred out. After 13 years, perhaps she's done doing interviews and ready to put the case behind her. John Hurst retired in January of 2019, but he still answers requests for interviews and just recently went on investigation discovery to talk about the case. He says he still looks for Brian when he is on vacation or in a crowd. One year, when he was running security for a football game, he thought he saw Brian and ran through the crowd to chase him down. But when he caught up to him, it was Derek. Being a religious man, Hurst believes in heaven, and although he may never find out what happened to Brian, he is confident that Randy has been reunited with Renee and has the answers he was searching for about Brian. As of February 2020, the case still makes the news on occasion, and local Columbus Facebook groups are always ready to try and bring the story back into the spotlight whenever there might be a possible lead. Over the years, several photos have turned up of Americans in foreign countries who bear a strong resemblance to Brian, but they have all been debunked, either by the family or facial recognition technology with the help of the FBI. As the 14th anniversary approaches, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer remains unsolved. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include the Columbus Dispatch and the 2 podcasts by Kelly Bruce. For a full list of sources or links to our contributors, please see our show notes. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.